My name is Oleh Havrylyshyn. I have been an economist, initially professor of economics in Queen's University and then George Washington, and later in a couple of other places. But as of 1991, 92, or earlier actually, when Ukrainian independence was around the corner already, I began to get back to my home country. I was actually born in Ukraine, but have been a Canadian citizen for these many years. In 1992, I returned for a full-time activity as Deputy Minister of Finance in Ukraine. Later, I became Ukraine's representative at the board of directors at the IMF in Washington. And after serving in that position for 4 years, I became a senior official at the IMF, essentially working almost entirely on the post-communist transition economies of the region, both in Central Europe and former Soviet Union. And Ukraine was at certain times part of my duties and responsibilities as a supervisor of activities in Ukraine until I retired from the IMF some years ago. Since then, I have been working on doing a little bit of part-time teaching at University of Toronto and elsewhere, and doing a lot of writing and research on the topic of economic transition and on Ukraine. My latest efforts came after a year and a half or so of being an advisor with the new post-Maidan government in Ukraine, and involved with a number of other colleagues working with the Ministers of Economy and with the presidential administration and so on. And then when that came to an end, I sat down and started thinking it's time for me to do a retrospective view of what has happened. 25 years is a nice round number anyway. What exactly has happened in Ukraine? Hence the output, which is already, my publisher tells me, Paul Craig Macmillan of the UK, is already available on e-format and should be coming out in hard copy any day now. The book that is called The Political Economy of Independent Ukraine, Slow Starts, False Starts, and a Last Chance. I think that subtitle gives any reader, before he cracks the book open, some idea of the theme. I wrote the book not only because I have been involved in Ukraine in many ways for such a long period of time, but also involved in other countries in the region, Poland, Croatia, Macedonia, the Kyrgyz Republic, etc. I wrote this book partly because there have been a lot of difficulties in Ukraine and a lot of questions as to why those difficulties arose. 25 years of independence has, of course, brought around a huge number of changes. But as many people who keep track of what non-Ukrainians in the West are saying realize, there is a perception that Ukraine has not been a success. To think of it as a failed state, as some observers have written, is by far extreme. I couldn't possibly agree with that. Things are not nearly the situation of Iraq or Afghanistan or other truly failed states. Yes, however, there have been many difficulties and shortcomings, especially on the economic, but also on the political side, as we know. And the point of the book is the central thesis of the book is to look at what happened and why it happened. Why it happened, I have a view that will not necessarily please Ukrainians here or there or in the diaspora. It is that for the most part, the problems on the economy side and elsewhere that have occurred are due to the bad economic policies of the leadership. That is to say, in the famous phrase from Julius Caesar, where Cassius is speaking to Brutus, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves." However, I think it is very important to counter the view of a failed state by pointing out that there are a lot of good things that have happened. And the bottom line, frankly, is that no matter what some statistics may suggest, is that life in Ukraine today for the Ukrainian citizens is far better than it was in Soviet times. For the most part, the book concentrates on economic issues, but it is entitled not The Economy of Independent Ukraine, but The Political Economy of Independent Ukraine, because the connection between the politics and the economic policies and economic results is something that one absolutely must recognize and look at. Okay, well, let me start with a overview of what we know 25 years has brought about in the economy. And in the slides available, figure number one is a figure of 25 years of what has happened to incomes of people, something that economists call the GDP, gross domestic product per capita. And that figure shows this value, this trend for, first of all, Ukraine and Poland, the black heavy lines in that chart, but also for reference for Central Europe, the Baltics, and some of the other FSU countries. Well, the obvious striking thing is that while all of them started back in 1990, you see this clustering, at about the same level of measured per capita income, $2,000 to $3,000 per capita. By the year 2012, 2013, 2014, the Central European group, and Poland in particular, the heavy line that climbs upward, the heavy black line that climbs upward, moved way ahead. Now, I think the comparison with Poland, of which there is a lot in the book, is an extremely apt one for several reasons. First of all, Poland and Ukraine are about the same size in the socialist camp. Secondly, they are close neighbors with close relations of all sorts, historically and currently, economically and politically and socially and culturally. And third, the Polish economy and the Ukrainian economy, despite some different orientations, were basically very similar to each other. Ukraine more strongly agriculturally oriented, but not by a huge amount. Both of them medium level of advancement in economic well-being of the population. Both of them fairly industrialized economies with a lot of heavy industry, coal and steel and machinery and so on. And what is most striking and surely unpleasant to any sympathizer of Ukraine is how, starting at about the same position, Poland has moved very rapidly to have a per capita income of 3 to 4 times that of Ukraine today. Actually, after the Russian military aggression, the economy of Ukraine has deteriorated somewhat. That doesn't necessarily show that clearly here. But the 25 years of trend is for now, the main thing that's important. Now, many non-economists criticize the economic profession for concentrating on this GDP per capita number as if it captures everything. Well, it doesn't, and economists are not quite that stupid and know that. And there are different ways of measuring how well people live. One of the most common is on figure number 2, something that is called the Human Development Index, which tries to combine and assess not only production of GDP, per capita income, but other measures like health and life expectancy and levels of poverty, and that is how the income is distributed. So that is a good corrective, which gives a broader picture than the GDP. Well, what do we see from that? We see exactly the same story as we did in just the GDP per capita. The Ukraine and Poland started about the same place, back at the left corner of the left side in 1990. And by the time you get to 2010, 14 or so, Poland has surged ahead hugely. Ukraine, after a very substantial worsening in the first 10 years, it begins to recover after the year 2000, but by no means catches up to Poland. So again, a huge gap has opened up between Poland and Ukraine. And that is true not only for the comparison with Poland, but a comparison with several of the Central European countries, including these three small Baltic cases. So that confirms that Ukraine has fallen far behind. So even if you say, well, Ukraine's citizens do have better life today than they did 30 years ago, it's a pretty important observation to say, yes, okay, but others have moved forward and we have not. And this gap that has opened up between Central Europe and Ukraine is really quite important and not something to be sneezed at. One last indicator of poor economic performance, which and there are many others I could refer to, but I have one last in Figure 3, which I think is worth pointing out. There are several others in the book. And that is foreign investment. FDI is what economists use as shorthand for foreign direct investment. And this is shown in terms of a number of dollars per citizen of the country per capita. And it's not a value for the given year of 2012, but it's a total that has been accumulating since the beginning of the transition process in the early 90s. And here again, we see how far behind Ukraine is, with a value of about $1,500 in 2012. And by the way, because of the disturbances of the last Yanukovych years and because of the subsequent economic decline and the Russian military aggression, foreign direct investment in the last few years in Ukraine has been very, very limited, so that we don't see an improvement there. Well, this compares very badly to what we see in countries in Central Europe. With Poland, it's about three times higher. But Poland is not even the best performer in that regard. Some of the best are Czech Republic and Slovakia and Estonia. Little Estonia has got probably the largest foreign direct investment relative to the size of the population in the entire region at over 11,000 in this particular table. The question then arises, okay, why did this happen? Well, I've given a little bit of a hint that it has to do with the economic policies. How do you measure those economic policies? The point of economic transformation, transition, perebudova, perestroika, whatever you want to call it, is to move from a communist, centrally planned, socialist economy to a market economy, capitalist, private sector ownership economy, and so on. Well, how do you know how much change there has been? The institution that was set up in the early 90s by the Western powers, called the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is located and headquartered in London, was tasked with precisely the job of monitoring and helping the process of transition towards the market. And one of the things that they did early on is to establish something they call the transition progress indicator. That is a sort of a score of how far along have countries moved to make that change from a communist to a market economy. And this is seen in Figure 4. Now, Figure 4 at first sight may seem a little messy because there are so many countries covered, but the trends are clear. First of all, that figure is divided into two. On the left panel are all the countries of Central and Southern Southeast Europe and the Baltic countries, and then the countries of the former Soviet Union, exclusive of the Baltics, are on the right-hand side. The immediate impression that's most obvious, number one, is that everybody in that left panel has moved much closer to the top of the scoring compared to everybody on the right panel. And the top of the scoring is anything over 4, a score of 4 in the EBRD measure. The book explains a little bit how this is done and why the numbers 4 and not 10 or something like that. Anything over 4 is pretty close to a well-functioning market economy. So we see that most of Central Europe, with the exception of a few of the Yugoslav republics that are lagged behind, mostly due to the Yugoslav wars, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Most of them are close to having completed this transition to the market. Not true of the FSU economies. Now, Ukraine. Once again, I use the heavy, bold lines for Ukraine and for a pairwise comparison, Poland. So the heavy, bold lines in the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the chart are respectively Poland on the left and Ukraine on the right. And we see that Ukraine has been much slower in reforming the economy, making it a market economy, than Poland and its neighbors. The slightly less obvious fact that I think is of huge importance historically is in the early years. In the early years, and now one has to look at it visually, and the book goes into more detail. On the right-hand chart on Ukraine's line, heavy, bold line, in the first few years, and what do we see is that any progress towards the market economy was delayed for at least 3 years. In fact, the entire period of the Kravchuk presidency was a period of virtually no progress towards the market. Very little. Indeed, look at it this way. Look at all of the lines on the right-hand side, all of the countries of the former Soviet Union. In the first 3 or 4 years until 1994-95, Ukraine is the least advanced. It was even less advanced than the first administration of Belarus before Lukashenko, of Stanislav Shushkevich, who moved faster on economic reforms than even did Ukraine. Then there is a surge with the Kuchma presidency, with the support of surprising number of very reform-oriented people that Kuchma brought into his team, like Penzanik, like Roman Shpek, like Viktor Yushchenko as head of the National Bank. There is a surge and there is an effort to sort of catch up for the missed years, and you see Ukraine's line bolt upwards, but not quite catch up to the leaders. And more important, it comes to a halt and slows down by 1998. In fact, in the book, I characterize the Kuchma presidency as being Kuchma 1 and Kuchma 2. In the first 3 or 4 years, 1994 to 1997, 98, there was an economic reform orientation and surge. That one gives credit, has to give credit to Kuchma. In the second term, that comes to a virtual halt, and you see a flattening of that reform progress line. Afterwards, you begin to see a gradual, slow increase so that Ukraine at least comes to the middle of the pack of the former Soviet Union countries, but far from having caught up to Central Europe. So here is where I get this little glib phrase about economic reforms being too late, too little when they come in 94, and too slow afterwards. I thought it might be useful to add a few words here in words because the numbers are not readily available for the last 2-3 years since the post-Maidan government. Now, how to characterize the post-Maidan government? Well, obviously under President Poroshenko, but the substantive policy actions have also involved different cabinets and different prime ministers and so on. So I think the roles of the different prime ministers are also relevant. Reusman has been around for a while. The basic storyline is, on the positive side, there have definitely been progress in economic reforms. There has been a little bit of improvement in, for example, regulations on business. Thus, if you look at figure 5 in the slides, which encapsulates the position of Ukraine in 2012, before the last, effectively the last year of Yanukovych, Ukraine on the World Bank's scoring of how easy it is to do business, something called the Ease of Doing Business score or ranking, out of about 180 countries, Ukraine is very poorly scored as the 137th. Just to compare some of the other post-communist countries, you see Georgia and Latvia in the top 10 of the world. In fact, in the latest numbers, Macedonia is there as well in the top 10, top 20 of the world. Well, since 2012, there has been some improvement in that, and Ukraine's ease of doing business country ranking is about 82, 83 out of 180 countries. That's a hell of a lot better than it was, but it's still far from among the best of the post-communist countries. So they're beginning to catch up, but hardly what you would say catching up. That's the good news. The bad news is in the next chart, figure 6. The World Bank, in a separate kind of measure, looks at corruption problems and measures the position of a country, ranking of a country in the world of, again, about 180 countries, in terms of how well corruption is controlled. In that chart, the higher up a country is, the better the corruption control. The lower down, the worse it is. Ukraine has, at no point in its 25-year independent history, done better than be in the bottom 20% of corruption control category of countries. That's pretty poor performance. Now that was more understandable maybe in early years, in the years of especially Kuchma II, after he dropped his reform orientation from 97, 98, and in the Yanukovych years. But sadly, two things can be said. One, going back a little in history, is that even during the Yushchenko years, while there was a little bit of an effort and some success in controlling corruption, it was very limited. Ukraine moved forward from being in the bottom 10 to being at about the 20th percent point in countries of the world. In the Poroshenko years, what would one have hoped to see is that the improvements that there have been would be reflected in the corruption scoring in the world comparisons. It hasn't happened. The level of corruption in Ukraine, according to the World Bank and Transparency International, this organization in Germany and Berlin, which looks also at corruption issues, Ukraine is just as bad as it was 3 years ago. So that's another disappointment. That is it already at the stage of the huge disappointment of the Yushchenko years? Maybe too early to tell, but 3 years have passed and some progress has been made, but it's limited progress. Well, let me finish the technical part of this stuff by turning to some indicators which are more on the positive side. While the economic reforms, control of corruption, doing business climate is not a positive achievement by any means. Ukraine has fallen behind and stayed behind most of the post-communist region. On the democracy side, it's performed actually reasonably well. And this is figure number 7, which you have, I hope. This organization called Freedom House, located in Washington, D.C., has for many years done a little bit of assessment around the world of how advanced is democracy in a country. And here, I apologize for Freedom House indirectly. For those who are looking at this and may not be familiar with it, unlike the EBRD or World Bank scoring, here the higher you are, the worse. So they've inverted it. In that chart, most democratic countries, they're the ones that achieve the greatest level of democracy, are near the bottom, and this is Central Europe and the Baltic countries. You see that group, including Poland in the black heavy line. The most autocratic countries, like Belarus and Turkmenistan and so forth, and Azerbaijan, and to nearly as, not quite as bad, but close as places like Russia and Kazakhstan, are near the top. Ukraine is in the middle. Ukraine is, despite its economic falling back, despite its inadequate forward progress on economic reforms and movement to the market, has not reverted to an authoritarian state the way you have seen in the rest of its neighbors to the north and east. The level of autocratic and pretend democracy that one sees in some of these countries is far worse than in Ukraine. There was a little bit of a bad period in the Yanukovych years, but it was very quickly corrected, and it never reached the levels that you see in the neighbors like Russia. So Ukraine has done reasonably well on that score. It's also done well in some other ways, which I want to turn to if you permit, a summary. Now, no more charts. Last slide is just words to summarize what 25 years has been like. Let me start with the good. First of all, the democracy, which I have emphasized with these formal numbers. But secondly, harder to capture, but I think it's pretty obvious, is that Ukraine, which has had an independence quest for not just decades, but centuries, as those close to Ukraine know, has finally really achieved a status as an independent sovereign nation recognized around the world. It's recognized by virtually all countries individually, diplomatically, as a sovereign nation, by international organizations, be it the United Nations or the financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF and the European Union and so on, and less easy to capture in precision is the recognition by people around the world. When news stories about Ukraine's Orange Revolution, or then 10 years, decade later, about the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignities come across television screens, people around the world find it entirely normal to speak of Ukraine as a nation, not as an entity within some other federation or grouping or as a captive nation, but as a free and independent nation. And if I might state a sort of a viewer opinion, the notion that the Crimea annexation and the Donbass troubles are a pure and simple matter of military aggression by the neighbor Russia is entirely fully accepted by people on the street, even more so than it is by politicians who use cautious terminology. That's a very considerable achievement. And if the book is somewhat harsh on the Kravchuk presidency concerning the lack of economic reforms, I think in counter to that, there's absolutely no question that the Kravchuk presidency provided a beginning to an independent and democratic, reasonably democratic nation. Even by 1994, the elections that were taking place in the post-communist countries of the former Soviet Union, they already began to be fiddled with, and if you look at Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or something. But one has to recall, there was absolutely no question on the part of Kravchuk and his party and his colleagues that they lost the election and there's a new president. That's it. End of story, which is what it should be in democracy. Some political scientists and historians have sort of encapsulated the core essence of democracy as the fact that you can change governments without struggles, without fights, without military activity. That is definitely true in Ukraine. So that's quite an achievement. Last, and the book goes into this in more detail, I have not done so here, the standard of living of people in Ukraine is fallen behind Poland, fallen behind Slovakia. That's a very bad thing. But there is no doubt in my mind that the analytical information and all sorts of information clearly say people are far better off today than they were in 30 years ago in the communist period. When you talk to people individually, you may have some complaints and so on, but pardon me for the words, but hell's bells. As an economist, I have heard all around North America, whether it be Iowa farmers or Ontario consumers, that, oh my God, prices are going up, things are terrible. People complain all the time, not necessarily justifiably. And in the case of Ukraine, I'm not speaking about what happened in the last 3 years, but at least until recently, the advances in standard of living are unquestionable. And they do show up in some statistics of the United Nations, like consumption of fruit, consumption of vegetables and meat and amount of space. Ukraine's square meters per person of housing, square meters of housing per person has increased by 50%, according to the United Nations statistics. So that's quite an achievement. So things are better off. Now I turn to the bad. Well, I need not repeat, because it has been the emphasis of anything I've said till now. The standards of income and living and well-being of the population have fallen behind what you see in Central Europe. So in terms of the potential of where Ukraine should be, people are really far below the potential. And that's even without taking into account the deterioration of the economy since 1913, 1914. The doing business in Ukraine, climate for investment, for business, whether it be foreign investors or domestic investors, remains one of the worst in the post-communist world. It's improving slowly, but it is not improving nearly as much as it has done in places like Estonia and Czech Republic, Poland, and little Georgia, jumping out of nowhere since 2003, 2004 to become one of the leaders in that rating of doing business that I showed in a previous figure. Related to that is the level of corruption activities. And here again, the comparison with Georgia and the reasons for bringing in Mr. Saakashvili to Ukraine are self-evident. As of 2003, 2004, the improvements in control of corruption in Georgia have been enormous. The book devotes an entire chapter to a comparison of corruption activities and corruption, anti-corruption control, and so on in the region. And Ukraine fares very poorly. And the stories that, it takes a long time and so on and so forth do not bear up under scrutiny analytically, because if you look at other countries where a campaign to deal with corruption has been serious, it doesn't take a long time. It doesn't take more than 2 or 3 years. We should have been seeing a much improvement in corruption control in Ukraine until now. We haven't seen it. We haven't seen, just as an illustration of the problem is, we have seen a lot of administrative activities. Several organizations have been set up of the Anti-Corruption Bureau and so on and so forth, and a lot of talk. But as the old U.S. Congress saying says, you can talk the talk, but then you have to walk the walk. So far, we haven't seen anybody walking the walk. There have been no significant high-level figures brought to prosecution for corruption. Can it be done? Well, look, just a year and a half ago or so, a former prime minister of Romania was prosecuted, found guilty, fined, put in jail for a short period of time. Yes, you can fine top people. Oh, yes, but didn't Yanukovych do that with Tymoshenko? Well, that's a different story, which anybody knowing Ukraine knows was purely politically motivated. I would remind interested people that the actual initial charges against Tymoshenko, which took her to jail for a few months, were not for corruption. They were for doing bad for bad policy decisions as a prime minister. Now, if that sort of thing were to apply, let's say, in Canada, then we might be seeing Mr. McGuinty sitting in jail today for the messes he made with coal plants and nuclear power plants and withdrawal of contracts which cost the Ontario taxpayers $500 million and so forth. Bad decisions by politicians are not normally in and of themselves sufficient reason in democracies to prosecute and put politicians in jail. Actual activities of abuse of power, of financial gain, and so forth are the basis. The last point I would make on the bad side is we have a situation that is referred to by many as an oligarchic state, controlled by oligarchs. I won't disagree with that. The book doesn't disagree with that, but the book makes several qualifying points about that, and that is that it isn't simply a matter of the bad luck of some bad guys making themselves rich. How were they able to make themselves rich? It's the lack of adequate economic reform policies in the early years, and the continued lack of forward movement that allows a small group of very wealthy individuals to be so powerful that they can also influence politics. Here, the book will displease some, especially some politicians and some Ukrainians around the world, because the book says, wait a minute. The most common view of the oligarchs is that along came Kuchma, and he was a big friend of the oligarchs, and he helped create oligarchy. Well, actually, no. Oligarchy started in Ukraine in a small way, true, but the embryos came in the Kravchuk period, and the reason was the lack of any economic reforms. For those who have economics training, it might be easy to understand the notion of rent-seeking, and that is that instead of going out to the factory floor and making more profits than your competitor by making a better product, you go to government corridors and you get government privileges on taxes and subsidies and other sorts of things. The kind of non-reformed economy of Ukraine that one saw until 1994 was the breeding ground for these new capitalists, whether it be Ukraine or whether Russia or Kazakhstan. There's a lot of opportunity to get insider privileges and become very rich on the basis of those insider privileges. And a good story, a good thorough investigation of how oligarchs developed also confirms that most of the people who are very, very rich in Ukraine today had an insider connection, either themselves or they found a partner on the inside, so you could get inside privileges. That doesn't mean they weren't clever folks. They're very clever folks. You don't get there by not being clever. But the cleverness there was not how to make a better product and sell it abroad or elsewhere. The cleverness was how to use the government involvement to become rich. Anyway, Ukraine is now saddled with that problem. It is parallel to and part of the corruption problem, but corruption is far more widespread than this high-level corruption of the oligarchs. It's throughout the system. Let me add that there is worse than that. There is the ugly. And the ugly, of course, has to start with the one element which is not homemade, and that is the external aggression by Russia militarily. And that really makes things pretty bad in many different ways. International relations are complicated. The economy has been affected by it. A lot of international export opportunities in Russia, which are not unimportant. Think of Canada and its biggest neighbor, where most of Canada's exports naturally go, to the U.S. Well, in Ukraine, it's not most, but still, Russia is so close that the Russian economy is a very natural place for Ukraine to trade with, to export to, and to import from. That has been unnaturally cut off by Moscow. So that's a pretty ugly thing. There are ugly episodes like the Yanukovych years in putting political opponents in jail and playing games with the Supreme Court and with Constitution and with local elections, and a reversal of some democratic achievements. And Yushchenko, the disappointment with Yushchenko, I don't know whether you want to categorize it as merely bad or actually ugly. It's a personal thing. How badly do you feel that the Viktor Yushchenko presidency was a disappointment to the population? Last, I would say that the fact that we have had 3 years and there has been some progress in the area of some economic regulation improvement, the continued corruption control is still a pretty ugly stain on the image of Ukraine. Now, the Euromaidan people, the young critics and those who are involved, the younger politicians, began to be critical, as some outside observers, to some extent myself and some colleagues included, already by the end of 2014. Why has so little been done? Well, the response at that time was fair enough. It takes time to do these things. Well, by the end of 2015, 2 years have passed. It takes time to do these things becomes a little less convincing. A year later, by the end of 2016, bringing us to January 2017, 3 years have passed, and it takes time to do these things, especially when we see they can be done in other countries, is less and less convincing. I would stop short of condemning this government just as yet, because things have not fallen backward, and that's very important in experience of world economy around the world, of third world underdeveloped countries lifting themselves up, be it Japan 70, 80 years ago or Korea 50 years ago. The steady forward progress is sometimes just as important as big leaps forward. So it's still possible that we can see steady forward progress, but it is nevertheless disappointing. So we have a situation where there are lots of good things that should be recognized, must be recognized, but we also have this falling behind economically and uncertainties to do with the oligarchic system and corruption that really should be dealt with and addressed much more resolutely than they have been. First of all, corruption goes far beyond just this high level of millions and tens of millions of dollars benefits that oligarchs get from the system. It's at the middle level of top level bureaucrats who take bribes because they still are able to influence business decisions. You have to get a signature to build a building, to start a factory, to continue. This is also true judicially. Somebody can jump on you by taking you to court and bribe the judge to find a judgment against you, and you lose your factory. So it's widespread, and it's of course also at the petty level. It seems like the petty level is petty because you're talking about $5, $10, $20, $100 for something to do with the police or with the university entry or grade or getting a clearance to add a new kitchen to your home or whatever. But look, when you multiply 10, 100, 200 bucks per person by 40 million, hey, that begins to be like real money. That's billions of dollars of corruption. So that's not small either. Well, it's I think too simple to just think of this as being an oligarch problem. Secondly, the oligarchs didn't just arise out of somewhere as evil spirits coming down with their harpy claws and grasping the Ukrainian nation. They arose because they were given the opportunities to play insider games economically and become rich where others could not, and others are not allowed to. We're not allowed to, and even today, a small, medium businessman has a far harder time getting started and continuing work than an oligarch who can, first of all, pay much bigger bribes, and secondly, sometimes not even pay bribes, just pick up the phone and talk to a friend or an associate who's under their influence. So oligarchs were created by early political decisions, especially on the economic side. This is what, as one of the things that I emphasize in the book. Well, how to deal with it now that once they are in place? Well, you cannot eliminate them overnight, but there are two major mechanisms where there is the possibility of showing corrupt activities, and I'm sure for many of the very rich, whether you call them oligarchs because they have billions of dollars or you call them minigarchs because they have only hundreds of millions, many instances of bribing somebody must exist somewhere. I don't think there has been enough effort to uncover this. The lack of real serious activity at the prosecutor's level is rather disappointing. So that's a tool to let them know that the game is over. You cannot continue this way. The second way to let them know the game is over is to allow small and medium business full freedom and equal freedom of doing business, and you get new competition. Okay? All right, somebody comes along and becomes a billionaire because of a privilege in Ukraine, or because of they come up with a great idea as a Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or something in North America. But look, very quickly, they start getting competition from others. That's difficult in Ukraine. You don't easily compete with the big oligarchs because you will get mowed down by one or another of their mechanisms and influences through the government. The government has to step away and let small, medium business operate as it does in countries where there is a good business climate. That means it'll take some time before the oligarchs are forced into operating normally. But, look at Central Europe. It's not that there are no very rich people in Poland or Czech Republic or elsewhere. There are. But they have to be rich. They have to, in order to stay rich, they have to compete in the economy with new businesses, international businesses, and they cannot easily rely on picking up the phone and speaking to a high government official. That is the sort of thing that has to stop, and it hasn't yet happened in Ukraine. But I think far more important in this case is the tremendous uncertainty that's created by the military aggression in the East. As far back as a year or two ago, I remember speaking on the phone to a friend from days past, and we used to be EBRD as a chief economist, is now chief economist for one of the big international banks, and I asked Bill, what do you think it would take to get foreign investment to go up sharply in Ukraine? And he said, well, not for the foreseeable future as long as there is this war with Russia. So even if you have the improvements, foreign investment will stay low, unfortunately. But I think one should not ignore the fact that you can grow an economy with domestic investment just as well as with foreign investment. A new factory is a new factory, whether it is put up by a foreign company or whether it's put up by a blossoming Ukrainian entrepreneur. There's a story of a company in Halychina in Galicia of a chap who a few years ago started to make juices for the European market by simply going around and getting contracts with small farmers or kolhosp or big farms, old kolhosps that had fruit orchards, to buy up their or to provide them provide the material, and then a factory with a small amount of foreign investment, a factory to make juice and package it in such a way with the appropriate labels. This is before the free trade agreement with Europe, to sell on the European market. And look, the European market is phenomenally large. It's a huge market. There were these debates a little bit about, moving to join the proposed union of economic union that Russia was proposing, the so-called single economic space, or Eurasian Economic Union, later relabeled. Well, look, in terms of purchasing power, given the population size and high per capita income of Europe, the European Union today is a market that is about 10 times that of Russia. Huge, absolutely huge. And it doesn't take much of a little niche in these markets for a very successful, good-sized business of, the tens of millions or more revenue and hundreds of jobs. There's actually more of this happening than one realizes, because by focusing on the question, are we getting foreign investment, we may be missing out on the fact that domestic investors are taking opportunities of the new opening in the European market. And there has been, if you look at the Ukrainian Statistical Agency information on trade and exports, there was a worsening, but then there has been a rise again in exports towards the European Union. That will continue. It'll take some time to establish these relations, commercial relations. It'll take some time, for example, to get any proper safety and licenses and license for food products, especially. You have to get all of the clearances of the European agencies that these are safe products. So it'll take a little bit of time, but it's already happening. And the more that happens, the more the chances are that some foreign investors will say, hey, wait a minute, I'm missing out on something. Well, let's take a closer look. Am I really going to be bothered if in central Western Ukraine I do an investment? Am I going to be bothered by what's this low-level war that's continuing to happen in the east of Ukraine? Maybe not. So that may come with time, on the basis of the evidence that Ukraine is beginning to export products competitively to Europe, to the European Union. Well, what I think you said about the theoretical and practical combination is key to the answer. What back then, when you were perhaps following a course in transition economics, the focus was on the theoretical conception of how planned economy works compared to a market, and what is the path to go from one to the other, the theoretical one. Today, the less than, I think, the best book on transition economics, which I used for a course in transition a few years back at George Washington University, by Gerard Turley and Peter Luke, 2013, Transition Economics. It is packed with the exemplification of the theory through practical evidence of what has actually happened. And one thing that looking at the retrospective of what has actually happened is that you get a little bit better perspective on what was important and what was not important in the theoretical thinking. I, for example, am in the school of thought shared by some, but not all, economists, that the tremendous focus on privatization is not nearly as important after the fact as the idea of whether privatization was done fairly and transparently. Whether you did it fast or you did it slow, the really important thing was do it well, which means transparently. The privatization that occurred in many of the countries of the former Soviet Union was not at all transparent. It was a very much an insider game. If you were some kind of an insider, then you got fantastic deals. Think of the case of one of the best illustrations of how the big gain that you get from being an insider in privatizing big former state entities. The Kryvyi factory, huge steel complex in southeast, was privatized under the Kuchma presidency, late years of the Kuchma presidency, for about $800 million. And the new owners were Akhmetov and Pinchuk, two of the top rich oligarchs of Ukraine. By the way, sometimes some interpretations are that oligarchs compete with each other. Well, here you have a perfect example that they don't compete with each other. They collude as much as they can. Hey, guess what? When Pani Tymoshenko, the radical prime minister of Yushchenko's presidency, decided that they were going to renationalize the company, which through court proceedings they did, and they paid back these two guys their $800 million, and they put it to an open auction. How much did they get? Over $4 billion, more than 5 times the original value. That was a huge amount of insider benefit that these two chaps had. How is this? Was this done? Well, a non-open transaction such as that one involves setting up the rules of who can bid. And one of the things that the Kryvyi original sale was formally it was like an auction, but only certain people were allowed to bid on it, people who were Ukrainian-based and who had more than 5 years' experience in doing steel products at a certain very high level of magnitude. Well, that meant only 3 or 4 or 5 people who could bid. Now, collusion amongst them was easy enough to arrange. It was done, and these guys got a big deal. When you put it to a true open auction, hugely greater amount of benefit. Not only that you get more money for the government than selling these things, but the openness of privatization creates a climate of open business that we can all have an opportunity. It doesn't matter how big or small you are. Thank you for the mention of the war. I mean, I think that would be one of the conditions, is that there's got to be more progress on ending this conflict. How exactly to do it, I may have my own personal ideas as an individual, but as an economist, I'm not. I don't want to pretend to be professionally aware. On the economic side, I would say 2 things. One is finish the program that was started as early as 2014 by the first Minister of Economy, Pavlo Sheremeta, continued somewhat by the second Minister, Abramovichus, the Ukrainian-Lithuanian guy, both of whom gave up and quit after a while because they were being blocked. They were allowed to do a little bit, but not much. Look, 83rd place in the rating of doing business is better than 130th place, but how come Georgia and Latvia can be in the top 10 and Ukraine can't even get to the top 50? You got to move more on that. There's still a lot of regulation, and there's still a big bureaucracy that has power it should not have. You've got to eliminate that, including reducing the size of the bureaucracy that controls business. Second thing that I think has to be committed to is that state firms that are pretty good size, not huge ones anymore. Most of the huge ones have been sold off in one way or another, for better or worse. State firms of a medium size should be privatized much more quickly than they are being privatized. There has been a promise for 3 years, and a very small portion of them have been privatized. Now, what's the problem with these state firms? Two is they can be a drain on the budget, because if they operate at a loss, the budget has to cover the loss of a state firm. Okay? Simple enough. But a much deeper hidden problem is that these state firms are the vehicle for continued forms of corruption. Corruption in Ukraine today at the high level, it has a different nature than it did 25 years ago or 10 years ago. Back then, it was getting great deals on privatizing big state assets. It was getting privileges to sell where others were not. In other words, you were getting monopoly privileges. It was getting, it was all of these gas deals, which have come to an end with the raising of the price of gas to normal international levels. Today, corruption in Ukraine comes from state firms needing to go out and buy products and setting out contracts, and those contracts being padded. In Canada, we know some of that activity in Quebec highway construction. There have been a lot of corruption investigations of that sort. Well, that's penny ante stuff compared to how big it still is in Ukraine. The comparable kind of corruption we see in a non-communist economy is in Italy. This has been a bane of the Italian economy for decades, referred to as tangentopolis, what you do on the edges, on the tangent of the society, is that state entities like the railroads and electric companies, they have to go out and buy products. Now think of the railroads in Ukraine, which are still state-owned. And I'm not suggesting they should be entirely denationalized, maybe not. But think of how big they are and how much they go out and buy regularly every year of services, of the tea and coffee and sandwiches that are served on the passenger trains, of the freight services, of the replacement rails, of the replacement wagons, this, that, and the other. Huge amounts of money. And if you add an extra 10% to the contract which you give to your friend, you have an easy way of transferring state funds to the private hands. Got to reduce that very considerably in the case of Ukraine by selling off a lot of these entities. I think it's important to start with the notion that it's still better in Ukraine today than it was in Soviet times, because moving even as incompletely as Ukraine has, moving to away from the socialist central plan system has provided for a much better way of life. And even just on the economy. I mean, I'm not talking about the freedom for people to travel for vacations in Turkey and elsewhere, or you go shopping in Vienna when you can. That didn't exist in the Iron Curtain days. However, I don't think one should be satisfied with being better than Ukrainian socialist Soviet Republic was. One should be looking for achieving as close to full potential as possible, which has happened in Central European countries. Why has it not happened in Ukraine? And I think here that I would emphasize, look, wrapping yourself up in the flag has always, by intellectuals over the centuries, never been considered to be true patriotism. Fine, you can be supportive, you can emphasize the positive, but you also have to be open-minded and critical about shortcomings. The leadership of Ukraine has disappointed the much more democratically oriented people. Look, nobody expected after the failure of the Orange Revolution that the people were ready to come out again, yet they did. They did, and there was this big Euromaidan thing with European orientation and an understanding by the people who did that this was not enough. And one of the elements of that understanding, from my experience of talking to people and reading, is that they were aware of this comparison that I made, that Poland and Ukraine used to be at about the same level of well-being, income, and that today Poland is 3-4 times higher. How come? We want to have the same as Poland got. There should be a continued pressure on this, and I think that one should be pushing political leaders to think less about their own pockets and more about the national interest, because it is only they who can really do this. Fine, people will come out on the street and will chase away a bad guy like Yanukovych, but they cannot walk into government offices and then operate the country properly. That has to be done by a smaller coterie of political and bureaucratic leaders. What can we do to make these people have more of a national conscience, to do more for the nation, what is good for the nation? Clearly, it's not there yet, because if it was there, we would have seen corruption control information that's much better than it is. It's the leadership that has been most disappointing, not the people. It so happens that one of the heroes of the libertarian economist of free economy movement in the West, in America, represented by such outfits as the Cato Institute and others, is an Austrian economist by the name of von Mises. And von Mises, in one of his books in the early 40s, wrote something like, whenever you see a bad economic performance, you can be sure that this is due to bad leaders. Guess where von Mises was born? In Halicina. In the Austro-Hungarian late years, von Mises' father was a small-level official bureaucrat in the area of Drohobych, outside of Lviv. So we have a Ukrainian, as it were, already making the statement of what is the problem when you don't get good economic results. You have bad economic policy, and it's the leaders that are responsible for this. You got to press them.